Welcome back to Civil Wars. I'm William Spaniel, and this lecture is on whether conflict is unavoidable. And as we previewed previously, we're going to see that in some cases it's impossible to guarantee peace. Last time we talked about when there was uncertainty about the relative costs of war. Now we're going to be talking about uncertainty over power, where I don't know how powerful you are, you don't know how powerful I am, and so when we fight, I don't actually know for sure exactly how much I expect to get from fighting. And what we're going to see here today is that we can guarantee the peace if the cost of war is high, but it's impossible to guarantee peace when the cost of war is low. So some of the time we will in fact get peace in that second case, but war is impossible to avoid fully in that second case as well, which is unfortunate, of course. And to see this, I'm going to illustrate the concept to you with a numerical example. So imagine that we have a situation where the rebel group R is strong half of the time and weak half of the time, and the government is strong half the time and weak half the time. So real simple setup here. If both are strong or both are weak, then the rebel group is going to win with probability 0.55. If R is strong and the government is weak, the rebel group is going to win with probability 0.75. And if R is weak and the government is strong, the rebel group is going to win with probability 0.35. So the stronger you are, the more likely you are to win. Conditional, though, on the fact that if the other guy is stronger, that's going to make you less likely to win. If he's weaker, you're going to be more likely to win. All right, suppose for the first case that each side is going to pay a cost of 0.05 if they fight. So in this case, the cost of war is going to be relatively low. If we plot out all of those different probabilities of war, depending upon whether one side is weak or strong, and apply the costs of fighting, then these are the expected payoffs for each actor. So in the top left corner, that's when both the rebel group and the government are strong. The rebel group would expect to receive 0.5, and the government would expect to receive 0.4, and so forth through the rest of the table. And I have those 1/2s all over the place there to remind you that half the time the rebel group is strong and half the time the rebel group is weak, and same thing for the government. So as a strong rebel group, you know that you're strong, but you don't know whether the government is strong or weak. And for example, if you're the weak government, you know that you're the weak government, you're not the strong government, so you're definitely on the second column there, but you don't know whether you're playing in the top row where the rebel group is strong or the bottom row where the rebel group is weak. There's the dilemma here. All right, so if we're thinking about designing a mechanism that works, we have a couple of principles we need to satisfy. First, we need to satisfy individual rationality. We'll also need to satisfy incentive compatibility in a moment. Remember that individual rationality says that we have to have the individuals willing to participate in the mechanism for the mechanism to be useful to us. And what individual rationality is going to imply here is that all types of players must receive at least their blind war payoffs. Because they could say, you know what, no thank you, I don't want to participate in this mechanism. I know you sent me a letter asking me to participate, I'm just going to refuse and fight a war. That's what individual rationality tells us. And so if we're thinking about this in terms of the strong rebel group, if the strong rebel group were to just say, heck with it, I'm going to fight, then half the time he would be facing the strong government, half the time he would be facing the weak government. And so in expectation, he's going to get 1/2 times 0.5 plus 1/2 times 0.7. Taking the average of those two, you get that the rebel group would expect to receive 0.6 if it were to fight a war blindly. So what individual rationality is then going to imply is that the strong type of a rebel group must receive at least 0.6 in any mechanism that we create. All right, now let's do the same thing for the government. If the government is strong, then half the time it will be getting a payoff of 0.4 because it's facing the strong type of rebel group. Half the time it will receive a payoff of 0.6 because it's facing the weak type of rebel group. So again, if you take the average of that, 1/2 times 0.4 plus 1/2 times 0.6, you get that the strong type of the government must receive a payoff of at least 0.5 in expectation if they're going to be participating in this mechanism. All right, now we have to think about incentive compatibility. So remember that incentive compatibility tells us that all types must be willing to honestly report their type to the mechanism designer. And remember that in these conflict games, types only matter for war payoffs. If there's a negotiated settlement, it doesn't matter whether you're weak or strong, you still get the same payoff for accepting that negotiated settlement. And if we're developing a peaceful mechanism here, the probability of war must be 0, right? Otherwise, there's some probability of war, which means we're not guaranteeing the peace. Well, this has an unfortunate interactive effect. Think about this for a moment. Can the game master give different peaceful payoffs to different types? You might want to pause this lecture for a moment and even think about this, maybe write a comment in the comment section, figure out if this is the case. Can a game master give different peaceful payoffs to different types and have this mechanism work out appropriately? Well, I'm going to answer this question right now. The answer is no. If one type receives more, then another type would have incentive to lie. And what we're seeing here essentially is that incentives to misrepresent are striking again. So again, once more, if we're only looking at peaceful mechanisms, then we're not having war payoffs here. We're only getting peaceful payoffs that are guaranteed. So if another type of me, say the strong type of me, is going to get more than the weak type of me, it's going to happen because it's purely through a negotiated settlement. Some offer size is just being given to the strong type. And if I'm the weak type, in order to fulfill incentive compatibility, I need to be willing to honestly report my type as the weak type. But if the strong type is going to receive more, and as the weak type I'm not going to be punished with higher degrees of conflict, I'm not going to be willing to honestly report my type. So there's actually something really neat that we just proved right there. If negotiations always end in peace, then the terms of the agreement are going to be identical for all types. So if we're going to be entering into some sort of negotiating pattern, which always results in peaceful outcomes, this is kind of crazy, then it doesn't matter how strong you are or how weak you are, when you enter the negotiation process, you're ultimately going to receive the same payoff. That's kind of neat. All right, moving on. What have we just figured out using this piece of information? Well, if we're bringing everything together, remember that the strong type of R must receive at least 0.6 through individual rationality, and incentive compatibility means that the weak type must be receiving the same amount, so the weak type of the rebel group must receive at least 0.6 as well. Same thing with the strong type of the government. The strong type of the government through individual rationality has to receive at least 0.5, and through incentive compatibility, the weak type of government must receive at least 0.5 as well. All right, if we add those two values together, we need to give at least 0.6 to the rebel group and at least 0.5 to the government. You'll notice that that sums up to 1.1 that we will have to divide between the two parties, but the object we're negotiating over is only worth 1, so this is impossible to do, which means no peaceful direct mechanism exists, and it is impossible to guarantee avoiding war here. We might get a peaceful outcome some of the time when we're negotiating like this, when there's uncertainty about power and the costs of war are low, but we can't guarantee for sure that we'll avoid war. So some degree of war is inevitable here. All right, now let's think about this when the costs of war are high. Before, the costs of war were equal to 0.05. Now imagine that they're equal to 0.15. And so if we redo the payoff matrix from before, we're essentially just subtracting an additional 1 from each player's payoff. This gives us these payoffs here, right? There we go. So war is more inefficient than it was before. It's costlier than it was before. And if we're thinking about the requirements of our mechanism, first, individual rationality, again, tells us that all types of players must receive at least their war payoffs. So if we're going through the same process as we did when the costs of war were low, then if you're the strong type of rebel group, you need to receive at least the average of 0.4 and 0.6, 0.4 times 1/2 plus 0.6 times 1/2, which is equal to 0.5. The strong type of a rebel group must receive at least 0.5 in any always peaceful mechanism that's satisfying individual rationality. And if we're going to be doing this with the government, then the government half the time will get 0.3, half the time will get 0.5. That averages out to 0.4. So through individual rationality, the strong type of government must receive at least 0.4. Well, if we apply incentive compatibility, remember we're looking at an always peaceful mechanism, so that means all players and all types of those players, I should say, not all players, but all types of any one individual player must receive the same payoff. So the strong type of rebel group must receive at least 0.5, the weak type of rebel group must receive at least 0.5 as well, and then if we're looking at this different player, the government, the strong government must receive at least 0.4, and therefore the weak government must receive at least 0.4 as well, due to incentive compatibility. Okay, well, bringing everything together once more, now we have to divide at least 0.5 plus 0.4, which is equal to 0.9, between the parties. And this is now doable. The object is only worth 1, but 1 is worth more than the minimum that we need to divide between the players, 0.9. So that means peaceful direct mechanisms exist in this case, and it is possible to avoid war. So the takeaway from this lecture is, well, there's two of them. First, when the costs of war are high, problems are solvable with uncertainty about power, but that's not the case when the costs of war are low. When the costs of war are low, there's some degree of war that's always going to happen, no matter how you're negotiating. Now, the good news here is that there's a way to fix this latter problem. Remember, the problem here is purely that the costs of war are low. If you have a third party, though, that's willing to subsidize peace, essentially write a check for some amount if the parties are willing to come to an agreement, then this functionally makes those costs of war higher. And if you're making the costs of war higher, then you go from the first case, potentially, or rather the second case here, the second bullet point when the costs of war are low, you potentially move yourself up to that first bullet point when the costs of war are high. So this is why third parties very often will try to subsidize peace. If they think that a war between a government and a rebel group will lead to some negative externalities onto that third party, the third party is going to be willing to pay some sort of subsidy to convince those parties not to fight each other. And this is why that happens, through this mechanism. All right, I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope you thought that this was interesting to see that in some cases we can't actually avoid war for sure. And I hope to see you next time. Take care.